where I've seen the most success is building my own relationships with these people. If a coach is watching a tennis player with practicing a swing, they don't see them mess up and then wait till the end of the season to tell them. They tell them in that moment, either in the live scenario or right afterwards. And I think that's a beautiful metaphor because that's for me what the goal is. They might watch one of their teammates do a sales call or present at a marketing meeting. I think the key here is getting to a point where you can pull that person aside afterwards or in your next one-on-one and say, hey, let's review how you think that went. I just got stuff to say. I want to say it to you and then move on to my next thing. And that way I'm giving feedback. There's also an opportunity there to solicit it. How do you think it went? What would you want to see done better next time? Those types of practices done over weeks and months can get you to a point where you have a team that is actually excited and taking action around sharing feedback more frequently.
Welcome to The Path to Wealth, the show about well-being, fulfillment, and financial freedom. And I'm your host, Hannes Henty. Welcome back to The Path to Wealth. Today we have Ryan Giordano. He has been with Pandora, Blend and Gong, shaping culture in fast-growing, fast-paced startups. He's making sure everybody is taken care of, that mind, body, and sustainable business growth is in alignment. He now has his personal coaching practice, and he's here to share more about his insights, what it takes to not only shape culture in a sustainable way, but also find self-awareness and alignment with yourself. So welcome to the show, Ryan.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's exciting to be here.
So maybe tell us a little bit more about your personal journey. How did you get into this field of work?
Sure. Yeah. So right outside of college, my first job was I had to wear a full business suit every day and walk the streets of San Francisco, essentially knocking on doors, trying to get into businesses. And the purpose of that job was to sell health insurance packages to companies. It's less relevant to the story, but the idea is I learned a couple things during that time. One is I spent a bunch of time knocking on the doors of startup companies, and I would actually go into their offices and try to meet with people to try to sell my services. And in that time, I noticed they're not wearing suits. They're having a lot more fun. Sometimes there's music playing. So I started to get attracted just to the culture, or what we call the culture of these offices and how they work. And I thought, wow, I mean, if they let you wear a t-shirt to work, they must really just care about who you are and how you work versus how you present yourself. Not entirely true, but definitely a lesson that I took home with me. Another part of it was that at this first job right out of college, my training was non-existent. I was hired into a very small company, and the two founders of that company essentially thought, we're just going to have these two new salespeople copy our style by watching us and then just figure it out along the way. And that was a struggle. It would be a struggle for anyone, but one thing that made it loud and clear to me was that there were no training materials, there was nothing documented, no real instruction or onboarding, things like that. And so right out of college, I began to be very interested in how can you improve an employee's chance of success when they join a company. And so fast forward about 10 months, I only lasted about 10 months at that job before I quit without another job lined up. I just couldn't take it. There was too much, it was a sales job, and there was just too much oversight, too much critique. Everything from the way I did my hair to how much time I spent on a bathroom break was being assessed and criticized, and that's just not healthy for anyone. So I got out of there without another job lined up. The good news is that in the background, I'd already been interviewing with Pandora and talking to them about the possibility of joining one of their advertising teams. And so that's where my story really begins. When I joined Pandora, about 6 weeks after I quit that first job, I joined an advertising team where essentially I was a coordinator servicing other account managers and figuring out if they needed assets uploaded to the web for advertising or they needed emails written to clients, things like that. But also in this job, the training wasn't superb. It was better, certainly better, but it was mostly in the form of previous employees having nothing and then writing a note to themselves and then sharing that with the next person. And so immediately I felt so welcomed. This was a company that, employees who had brought me in and interviewed me told me, once you're hired and you're here, you can ask anyone any question and ask them for their time. They will share their story and teach you things. And hearing that, I think I took that maybe more literally than it was intended. And so I began interviewing internally. Even though I just joined, I started setting up meetings with anyone who would take my time. And I worked my way up from teammates to cross-functional teammates to managers, supervisors, directors, and eventually got in front of a couple vice presidents. And I had some really chance meetings there. And a lot of what I learned in those meetings helped me along my way in figuring out like, this is going to be a company where I can build a career for myself. You don't just have to wait around. You can find problems that you want to solve. And if you can talk to the right people, you're going to get a chance to solve them. And so about 3 or 4 months into this new job, I was interviewing a VP of my department. She overseed about 400 people in what we call the revenue operations department. And she was asking me, as leaders do, what do you think we could be doing better? And that's when I rolled out my notes on training and and onboarding and started telling her, well, here's how onboarding could be improved and strengthened for our new employees. And I think it was part luck, but also part effort on my part. But what happened in that meeting is that the VP shared, hey, I have some exciting news for you. We have a director who is leaving her department, and she's going to be starting a training team from scratch. And I really think you should consider applying. And so that's really where my journey begins. I think there's much more to this story, but I'll just pause and see if you want to check in on anything there.
See, it seems that, you already put so much thought into it, and then you were also moving, kind of leaning into your preparation, sharing it with her. So you were more prepared than anybody probably that she was talking to at that point to take over that role. So it's the luck of the prepared, huh?
I think you're right. I think, I don't blame anyone for not having that experience or thinking to do it if they don't. But something I've observed, in my 10 years since starting out in that job at Pandora is that many employees are pretty much anxious and wanting to make moves in their career, whether that's getting more responsibilities or experience or more titles or better pay. But they don't always know what to ask for or how to go about it. They just get to the point where they're in front of someone and then they kind of spin out and they don't know where to go from there. And so I know other people were taking meetings with this vice president, but I think a lot of it was more just to, maybe if I get FaceTime, it'll lead somewhere. And I think not always bringing solutions and ideas is something that really wakes someone like that up to, meetings that they're having on a recurring basis.
Yeah. So I want to unpack your story a little bit. In the beginning, you said it was a small team, a sales culture. And obviously you probably went through a lot of rejection, knocking at people's doors and a lot of no's.
Yeah.
So you probably also grew somewhat more resilient there. But at the same time, for someone that has a small team, or maybe it's the first 2 hires they make in their company, how do you think they should go about onboarding? Because for them to create training modules for the first maybe 2-3 hires is very time intensive. So how do you think somebody who's legitimately just starting their business or has a small team could go about that without kind of going the wrong direction? Because maybe they don't even know what kind of materials they need to put forth so it's successful onboarding.
Yeah, spinning with ideas just hearing you say that. So I've got two different ways to look at it. So one is from the employee's success metrics. So I always try to put the employee first. I think that's something you and I share in common, and not even the employee, it's the human, right? So if you're a founder or a small startup and you're bringing a new employee in, the first thing you want to think about is their experience. And essentially that's what promises were made during the hiring process, especially around how quickly, they will be up and running in their role, what they can expect from the job, things like that. So I find it's really valuable to think about it from the employee's perspective. If they come in, what do they expect to happen in the first 30, 60, and 90 days? How can I support them on that journey? And I think paired with this is the other perspective, which is your perspective as the hiring manager and or the boss or founder of the company. And that's your success metric. So I'm hiring a role or I'm opening a job in order to solve a problem. Often that's, first jobs you're usually in sales, or sometimes they're in engineering, in that you're having someone build something. But if it's sales, you're hiring them so that they can bring in sales. And so you've defined that for yourself. How many, at what point do I expect them to be at a point where they're bringing in a certain number of, whether it's inbound leads or cold information. I mean, it's really whatever you're trying to establish that role for. So setting that metric and figuring out how do we get that person there is really the exercise I would have them go through. So say you want a salesperson, by their 4th month, you want them to be able to fully operate independently. Well, you need to define what that means and then work backwards to figure out how to get them there. And I think this is what people struggle with, is figuring out what is a really human and realistic approach to how to define what's the best use of time in that first 30 days. Because sometimes people will jump ahead to, details or really complex situations or how to solve a unique client objection. So really organizing your information in a way that would make sense to any human approaching a new process.
As somebody who is starting at a new startup, and let's say those things are not in place, what do you think a successful communication looks like to maybe get some alignment? So because it's not, it could be really frustrating, just like it was frustrating for you to not have that. Next step is, okay, now you're not in alignment with what the founder thinks is appropriate, and then the micromanagement start, and the micromanagement is probably the end of the relationship anyway if it's not being addressed, because nobody loves to be micromanaged, especially if it's to the extreme where you're getting pulled up for bathroom breaks and all kinds of small things, because that's really the end of the relationship, I guess.
It certainly was, yes. So I suppose there's a couple ideas I have here as well, and this is a part of what I'm working on now, which we can get into at some point. But I think that so many companies rely on HR or the learning team or the onboarding team to get this work done. And I think from a company side, that's understandable. You want to put someone in charge of this. And if you're a small company, one of the co-founders or someone on the team has to have that as a dedicated responsibility. I think that's starting point number one. If it's all just kind of someone should do it and we'll build a doc together, that's not going to be effective. There needs to be a responsible party that their job is making sure, amongst other roles, if you need to do it that way, but one of their responsibilities is making sure new hires are successful and understand what's going on. But from the employee perspective, if you're the person joining a company, something I'm just starting to advocate for and wanting to build more tools around is essentially self-onboarding. Because the idea here is that you can't rely on every company to be an expert at this. And there are companies who do a really great job of being very thorough, both from a technical responsibility perspective, but also a cultural integration, helping you meet people and things like that, which is really great, being pro-social. But I think I'm very interested in figuring out what can people learn to do for themselves when they're joining these companies. So that might start with something as simple as a gap analysis, looking at wherever you just came from and what job you were doing, how is that different from what you're doing now, and trying to figure out what are my strengths that I can bring from my previous role into this new job, and what are gaps that I'm going to have to ask for help for. And so thinking through your own, and I think a lot of really productive and, developmentally driven people do this type of stuff anyway. And so I think it's well timed that we share these types of tools with more people so they can figure out how do I onboard myself and figure out what are the gaps, what are my strengths, and that leads you to what you want to ask for. And I think that really is the ultimate result here. I think your beginning question was essentially, how do you get alignment between the employee and a founder who are trying to, or a startup, executive who are trying to figure out what the responsibilities are, what good work looks like for the employee. So I think it's up to the employee to ask for that. I think many employees will tell you, well, that's on my manager or my employer to make that clear. And technically that feels right. But we're moving into a world continually where it is just so much more valuable for you to own that side of your career as the individual.
But where do people kind of grow that level of self-awareness? Like, I think most people that leave high school, they're not really tuned in to that degree. I'm like, wow, these are my strengths, and I'm here in this new company, and if I bring in my strengths in this particular field here, that will really be a successful relationship. I feel like even into their 30s, some people are not necessarily tuned into their strengths, and it's kind of, an unveiling of what they're strong is. So how do you help people identify that?
That's a great question. And I think I have a more long-term vision for the solution or a dream, and then I have more short-term practical answers. So the long-term solution, or what I would view as where I hope we move, is a broader I guess I would like to see society adapt more mindfulness and meditation techniques and things that actually help with self-insight. The reason for that being that a lot of people are completely out of touch with feelings that they feel or ideas that they have and where they come from and what that means for them. And so often we can feel a feeling or get a story running in our head, and we're just going to commit to that. Like, that is the way that things are. Either I'm angry or scared, or I feel that someone's, putting me at a disadvantage, and I'm just going to play the victim or whatever that needs to be. I think that work in mindfulness and self-insight can be really revealing, but that's a whole other story. I think in the short term, the answer to this question is really, it's a piece of that. It's getting in touch with, you have a want, you have a desire, you have a feeling, getting curious about that and wondering, why is that feeling there and how can I do something about it? So I'm not sure if your question is like, what's the societal fix or what is my recommendation here?
Yeah, well, maybe on a personal level. Let's say I'm somebody who just left high school. I'm trying to tune into what are my strengths, because I might not even know.
Yeah.
Oftentimes what
Yeah.
our strengths are, it seems so natural to us that we wouldn't identify it unless somebody else might identify it for us.
Yeah. Love that. So, from a personal perspective, this starts with having conversations where you take the risk of asking, what am I good at? Where could I improve? And this is another, I could talk for hours on end just about feedback, and running feedback programs at companies has been a big part of my jobs as I've taken on leadership roles in learning and development. One of the core responsibilities tends to be, can you create and then instigate and then maintain a feedback program across hundreds of employees in the company? And so, but through that work, I've spent a bunch of time talking one-on-one with people who feel it doesn't work or isn't working for them. And usually the conversation then it revolves around how can they capture the insights for themselves. So this is another tool I'm very interested in building, but essentially a user research kit for getting feedback on yourself. And it's something I think can be duct taped together very easily. You can create a Google form that says, I'm working on this project or this behavior or this skill, and you can send it to 5, 10, 15 of your closest friends, colleagues, family, etc., and essentially start to gather data from other people that tells you where do you see me light up when I'm talking? Where do I naturally seem excited about conversations? Those tend to be things like your passion or things that you truly care about, regardless of work. But another question you can ask is things like, where can you rely on me, or where do you see my skills really consistently come into play? But I think what really, so it's always great to get the positive feedback. What's even more challenging and I find more rewarding, and again, this is people who are developmentally minded really do focus on this stuff because they've got that negative voice already telling them they're not great in their head. So it helps to actually go to other people and say, again, whether it's a survey or a live conversation, going to trusted people and saying, I'm aware that I'm not the best communicator or project manager. How could I improve? How could I get 5% better? And so there's a couple tactics in there. One is making the ask. Two is making it clear you're not asking to make a huge change. You might say something like 5% better to key in the other person to the idea that like you're not asking them to fix your life for you. You're just saying, what would make me even more reliable or trustworthy in your as a coworker. But also then, whether it's implied or explicit, giving someone else permission, which is something you learn when you run these feedback programs at companies. There's a key step in there between humans when you say, hey, I want this feedback, please. I'm asking you to share things that might be hard to say, but will help me grow as a person.
So from a feedback conversational perspective, I've had feedback rounds in the past where I did not feel comfortable opening up because, for example, maybe the environment wasn't safe. How did you establish those kind of safe environments around those conversations to make sure that everybody actually, I think at the end of the day, everybody will hold back to some degree because it's still a work relationship, but make it at least safe enough that people feel that they can actually address their concern and they feel heard?
Yeah, so that's a great question as well. A couple thoughts on that. So one is getting to the root. At its base, it's getting to the root of the fear. So bothering to take the time to understand what is it that turns people off about this experience. And I've gone through this process at several companies, so I can share some common areas. One is general privacy, especially as it relates to the company. And so there's a concern that, especially if you're typing feedback into a platform like Culture Amp or Lattice, and that then gets shared, stored and then shared with another employee. I think there's a couple of fears there. So one is the general privacy. If I want to share feedback with you, that's you and me talking. But if I want to share it and it's now in a system, there can be a fear of, is someone in HR looking at this? Is someone else, is my boss's boss seeing this? And then this expands into a bunch of other fears. Is this going to affect my performance rating? Is this going to affect the other person's performance rating? And so a question comes in if, I might want to give you say you and I are colleagues at the same company. I might have feedback for you, but when it comes time to type it in, I'm worried, am I going to cost you a promotion? Am I going to hurt your standing by writing this? And usually the person running this program does their best to communicate that that's not the case. But because of the way that, many people bring with them the experiences from previous companies, where often they have been mistreated or seen this privacy violated, there's a big lack of trust in there. And so I think that's one of the key things that I worry about and that we see happen. So some of the ways that we try to counter this is actually by doing are best to literally uncouple this from any performance practices. This is a constant debate, and you'll see companies moving back and forth. So some companies really like to bring them together. So when they run feedback, that's also when they run pay raises and promotion cycles. And so oh, I just got a good review and I just got a pay raise. Like, some companies want to send the message that those things are correlated. And I think that there is value to that. But something I've also seen done and been a part of is actually trying to split those up by literally moving them down and apart from each other on a calendar. So making sure that they're months apart, so there's no confusion that this feedback is independent of your performance review. And that's where it gets challenging, because the honest answer is feedback is always being incorporated. Like, if your manager is seeing feedback or giving feedback, of course, that's going into their perspective on whether you're ready to take on your responsibilities. But I still believe in the idea of putting some space between those, so people don't think there's a certain way to game the system or the right answer to give when it comes to feedback that will lead to a promotion, because that's not the case.
But isn't there always like a right kind of checkbox path where you're like, okay, this is performance, and then the right kind of attitude generally leads to a raise or a better title, no?
Yeah, it certainly can. And that certainly depends on the type of company as well and how much structure they have built out. So some companies are young enough to not even get to the point where they have many roles for you to move into. And so you find in the back office that HR is rapidly creating just arbitrary, level 1, level 2, level 3, just, we need to give them a level, and we're going to, but at a certain point, if that's too much in response to just employee demand to have those things, it becomes more artificial. And to me, it becomes worth a lot less. And It creates really odd scenarios where I've seen people turn down product manager jobs because they want to be called a senior product manager. And I've been at a company where they say, well, where you came from, a senior is a regular product manager here. And I mean, in terms of responsibility and experience and all of that. But people go, I'm going to pass because I want to be called a senior, because that's going to get me the next thing at my next job. And at that point, I feel like people are missing the point, because you're now chasing and gamifying your career while passing up on opportunities to learn and grow, which is, if you know me, that's what it's all about.
Yeah, they're not in for the experience anymore at that point. They're just in for the title.
Well, and this actually comes up in the workplace, where people want to be called a program manager, but a program manager manages a program, not people. And so it creates confusion. And some companies will refuse to put manager in the title unless you're managing other people. And that's another thing I've seen debated, because people are always after, if I can just get that, maybe I can kind of maneuver my way into a management role and that'll work out. But it creates a lot of confusion to not have consistency in titling across all these different types of companies, even in the same industries.
So then what does good practice look like if you actually want to grow a business, and I mean, obviously, I think you want to attract talent that doesn't care too much for the titles and that cares for the growth more.
Sure.
That's probably one way to mitigate it, is just make sure that you attract talent that is looking for the growth opportunity and the learning more than the titles. But how do you mitigate that in best practice when you're actually growing a company from small scale to a larger scale?
And I think this ties back to one of your original questions, which is essentially how do you deal with this? And I think the other part of what I would want to say is that it's about bringing a true culture of feedback into a company. And this is so much easier said than done. And what I'm talking about here is not bringing in a keynote speaker and then having them leave. I mean, what we're talking about here is having a company where the leadership, from the founder or the CEO all the way down, actually believe in the idea of providing feedback that is useful and actionable. And one of the keys here, I mean, there's a couple keys to this. So actionable, meaning I've just told you essentially like what I saw you do, why it didn't work or help, and some version of what it might look to do differently. So if I just say, didn't like the way you showed up in that meeting, that's not feedback. That's just a critique. Feedback would be, hey, in the meeting, you seem unprepared. Perhaps next time, starting with an agenda to let everyone know exactly how the time will be run. That is a piece of feedback that is actionable by someone. It doesn't mean they have to take it, but it does mean you're doing the job of, and this is another interesting point, we used to call it giving and receiving feedback, but I met a coach who calls it delivering feedback, because your job is to not just like give it like, here we go. It's like, no, you have to deliver it. You're hand delivering it. You're making sure it's received. You're essentially making sure they sign off on it. If you just toss a critique out there, it's a lot harder to tell. That's more throwing feedback than delivering.
How do you manage the ratio of that? Because something that I've seen kind of in a psychological sphere of things is that humans tend to need like almost 4 times as much positive to take in like one critique. So how do you manage the ratio of delivering or giving feedback? Because I mean, there are cultures like maybe Bridgewater with Ray Dalio where they are super transparent and they're by default excluding 75% of the workforce because it's not for them and they can't take it. So there are some people who operate like that. But maybe for the rest of the population, the ratio seems to be slightly different and they don't want to get knocked off every single time. How does that work for people?
Yeah, I mean, this is a perfect example. So I've actually had the pleasure of working with some folks who came from Bridgewater into a startup I worked at during my time at Blend. And that was the first time I'd been exposed to people from that culture. Some of them were, I thank them for even coming to me and having ideas of how we might adapt some aspects of what was done at Bridgewater, because people do love it. And I, for any listeners that aren't aware, like what you're describing, they are next level. Like I'm pretty sure last I checked, every meeting is reviewed and every person in those meetings is reviewed. Too. Yeah. So everyone can see how it's done, how it sounded, how you showed up, and you can't escape that. And that's true transparency for me. I think I probably would put myself voluntarily in that 75% who I don't think I would get enjoyment out of that. But I also can see the value and see there's days when I dream about working in a place like that, because it's the challenge that I want to get to is when you bring in people from places like that, and then you've got people on the other end who are terrified of getting any critique, and you're mixing a bunch of people from that spectrum together, then it's hard, because if you're in my position, you're trying to roll out a feedback program and give general instruction, but the general instruction doesn't work the same, because there's some people who are like, yeah, let's go. Like, I want to give feedback, give it to me. And then there's other people who are really nervous just to even say anything below a neutral stance on how someone did, whether it's because they're afraid of causing trouble for someone, or they're just afraid of the interpersonal interaction of doing that. And so the answer here, and it's a tough one, it's not a quick fix, but the answer comes back to what I said before. It's about a culture. And the culture, the goal is always to have it be the actual whole company. So from the top down. But if you're a people manager, and that's a group that I'm very interested in working with and have spent a lot of time with, you essentially have access to create this type of culture on your own team. Now, it's going to be harder to manage and build, because outside of your team, it may not be being done the same way, but that's how you start, is by building trust with a small group of people. And so I've seen it done where one manager of a team of, say, 7 direct reports can establish a relationship with their direct reports where they're now excited about getting feedback. You alluded to this, but another thing about ratio is making it more frequent. So I think a common mistake we see made is we have 2 or once a year feedback cycles where every 6 months or 12 months, you're writing paragraphs of what someone could have done better over the last year. And there's a bunch of stuff wrong with this. One, it built the main thing being that it builds it all up into a single moment. And a metaphor we hear that comes from the coaching world is this: if a coach is watching, say, a tennis player with practicing a swing, they don't see them mess up and then wait till the end of the season to tell them. They tell them in that moment, either in the live scenario or right afterwards. And I think that's a beautiful metaphor, because that's for me what the goal is for a lot of people. So back to my example of a manager with a team of 7, they might watch one of their teammates do a sales call or present at a marketing meeting. And I think the key here is getting to a point where you can pull that person aside afterwards or in your next one-on-one and say, hey, let's review how you think that went. And this leads us to another great moment, which is soliciting feedback from the person you want to deliver it to. So a lot of people are like, I just got stuff to say. I want to say it to you and then move on to my next thing. And that way I'm giving feedback. But back to my phrase of delivering feedback, that there's also an opportunity there to solicit it. How do you think it went? What would you want to see done better next time? That opens the door for a person to reflect on themselves, share in advance what they think went wrong. And that way, whoever's giving the feedback can then react to that. Oh, you mentioned this. I also noticed that. Let's collaborate on how you might do better next time. And so those types of practices done over weeks and months can get you to a point where you have a team that is actually excited and taking action around sharing feedback more frequently.
At the same time, if you hit people up, let's say after every other call, that could be, for some extreme outliers, could feel like micromanagement again, because they feel like, oh, he's always on top of it. So I feel like there is no silver bullet to this, because it's very much on an individual basis, right?
Yeah, and what your comments there make me think of is that also another recommendation in this space is that you're not coming to someone after every meeting to give different pieces of feedback. Because if we as human beings can really only grow and change in so many ways at once. And so if your ideal setup is to be able to give feedback on any action that an employee is taking at any moment, sometimes that's just not realistic, and it might overload the person with an amount of things to change. And so for me, it's more about establishing a relationship where you say at a certain point, you actually capture what that individual wants to work on and what area they're growing in. Essentially, then they're opting into this conversation rather than kind of being micromanaged. And they're like, I just have to take it because you're my manager and you're just going to tell me. You're asking them what they want to work on or what they think could go better. And then now you've established this conversation that, okay, we're both talking about, again, it's the most cliche example, but your meeting prep or how you show up for meetings. And that way you can start to trust that, yeah, that manager's noting those things every meeting, but they only may bring them to you every 3 meetings or in your weekly one-on-one or something like that. And so I think your point is well taken that just raining down information and feedback on someone is not a healthy way to help them change. But there is certainly a middle ground where the more experience you build and trust you build around giving light pieces of feedback, meaning you're not telling someone like they're just not a fit for the job, but you're just saying, hey, like you're at 80% with the way you're doing this one action. I'd love to see you get to 90 or 100%. Like here's a tip on how that might work. I think that's the sweet spot where people want to find themselves. And that way you're knowing that as the deliverer of feedback that the person receiving it hopefully isn't feeling overwhelmed. And if you're concerned about that, then you may check in on it explicitly.
So as someone who is in charge of culture the way you were, how do you take somebody from the one extreme on the scale where they might be super insecure about giving or receiving feedback to maybe not all the way to the Bridgewater, but closer to that? Like, because you're in charge of giving feedback, structuring feedback rounds and the overall culture, how do you make sure that you take those extreme outliers and kind of bring them together?
In my experience, I've done this at a couple companies, and one of the things that we started doing during my time at Blend, and then I repeated this process at Gong, is having, so one of my main audiences was managers. We also would train all employees across the map, but I'll use the example of how I train managers. So we'd have managers all get together either in a room or during COVID on a Zoom call, and we essentially would run a session that was about 45 minutes long. And I, as a person with background in training and development, would build a schedule that essentially is designed to teach for about 20% of the time, 30% of the time. So the first 20 minutes or so of the meeting is dedicated to teaching a topic, starting with why. Why are we bringing feedback to the company? What is the goal of this? And covering off on that, and we can get into that. Then going through the how, covering the platform and how it's gonna work and why we're doing it this way, and then getting into the what of what does good feedback sound like, and actually giving them a formula. So earlier I shared that my formula for actionable feedback is essentially saying what I observed and how it impacted me. So I saw you do this, it had this impact on me or the team or people around us, and you're sharing the information in that way. But then the key here to your question is practice, as with so many skills in life. And so we would build sessions where we would actually do these in 3 parts. As I mentioned, the first part would be teaching new information. So whether it's reviewing this formula or instructing on how the platform is going to work for the feedback. Then we would do about 20 minutes of practice. So I would take all our managers and put them in groups of 2 or 3 and actually have them, I'd either give them a scenario that I had kind of made up, or I would have them in advance bring a real life situation. What's feedback you've been meaning to give that you've been holding off on? Everyone has that. And so then they would practice on other managers, which was a great, you're taking a step outside your comfort zone, but it's not as risky, most likely, because the other manager, one, we talk about, privacy or confidentiality when we meet as managers. I also have them think about, like, by giving this advice or giving this feedback to another manager, they probably are going through something very similar, because it's not that different, the type of feedback that we have to give in the workplace. And so you're able to, as they're practicing this, they're also able to get like useful feedback from the person they're practicing on. And then the back half of the session would be to come back and do a debrief. So as a larger group, we would discuss, where did you get stuck? What is the language that's tripping you up? Because that's often it too, is people just want to get, it's kind of like writing an email or a blog, but they're like trying to get the perfect wording. And the real answer is like, there is no perfect wording. It's just about getting it out there and then being ready to kind of continue to negotiate and evolve the conversation, because, we as managers can be human and say, I didn't say that exactly how I meant it. Let's, continue to evolve it. But the short answer to your question is introduce the formula or method, have them practice it in real time, and then debrief that and actually find out, having now practiced it, where do you feel stuck? Where do you feel, where did that help you also? And having people share insights. Oh, when I say it this way, it's easier or makes more sense to me, and things like that.
I think everybody has that little something that they would like to share that they will never say.
Yeah, certainly true.
I also feel like they don't say it because if they would say it, they're probably not part of the culture anymore in a different way. Maybe they might exclude themselves, or they might actually get fired for it.
There is always a fear of, and that comes, that's a very an evolved trait that we picked up as humans, is we care often more about our standing in a group than we do about something that's kind of evolved later in time, which is like the evaluation of our work. Our standing in a group is something that's mattered since, as long as I think we know about evolution, and how people thought about who succeeds and gets to stay a part of the group, or people that are able to stay in a good standing, provide, relevance to the group, and then they get to stay in the group, which increases their chance of safety and thriving. And I think we still see that today in the workplace. So I agree. And all the more reason to work towards getting comfortable and building trust in a relationship where you can share those things.
Yeah, I guess pretty civilized. If we're not part of a group, we're close to dead by default.
Yeah. And I think that people feel that way in the workplace, and whether that, I think that concept of death in the workplace is more isolation. And it's feeling like if you don't have enough people that you enjoy communicating with at work, and you don't have enough going on in the rest of your life to really make it all make sense, then you feel isolated. And that can result in turnover, where employees quit just because they're not connected to people. It can create hostile people who, come and write a bad Glassdoor review because they had a bad experience. So I think, as this conversation has evolved out of your original interest just in creating culture and maintaining culture, this is why it's so relevant, not only to people in my position, but also to leaders in HR and the people department, and even sometimes the executives are really interested in how can we make sure people feel included and that they can communicate, because that's actually going to increase their ability to focus on their work and do meaningful work.
So I've seen some different extremes of companies. So there are some companies who, for example, drive culture through metrics, and you're basically part of the culture if you hit the metrics, if you're growth oriented, and that's probably most likely about actual sales, for example. And then there are other extreme companies, and I think one of those is here in New York, where they literally have a guaranteed job. And I think this is one of the craziest theories about employment culture I've ever heard of. But their theory is that basically, just like you wouldn't give up teaching a child how to walk, they're hired for life, and it's like an infinite safety net. And, eventually they will grow into something based on the safety that they have. And I think that's, from a business owner's perspective, it sounds close to insane to me to have such an extreme version of safety net that you will never get fired. Because how do you make sure that a company needs to be profitable to be sustainable? So let's say we're kind of in a recession right now. How do you mitigate that, where you protect culture but also the overall sustainability of the company? And I find that extreme is one, and then there are other extremes where it's all the culture is about profitability, which is great for hustlers. Then you attract 100 hustlers. It's everybody is in the drive and is running for the gold with you. But those are two extremes. So maybe you can give us some thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is great. So I haven't heard that actual example, so I'd love to know more about the company, because I'd be interested in following their journey. Essentially, what we're seeing today, and that's a great example of it, is everyone, and meaning many of these companies, are experimenting with different methodology. And so in Silicon Valley and in tech companies, the way that this is often driven, or certainly a component of it, is the idea that culture is driven by employees. And that usually comes out to mean, what are employees interested in doing, amongst their work while they're here? And so this can play out in a bunch of different ways. Sometimes employees want to bring parts of their personality or their identity or their lives from outside of what we would consider traditionally outside the office into the office. And so you see in the emergence of things like employee resource groups, which are usually focused on an identity group and kind of create an affinity crew around that, where people are, either producing events or solutions to something that matters to them, or they're responding to issues in the broader public and integrating that into the company. Another aspect of culture can just be actually trusting employees with how they spend their time. So I think my favorite example of this would be my time at Pandora. I don't know if this was ever made super explicit, but it was a culture where if you got up and walked away from your desk, very rarely was it questioned what you were doing, because I think it was well known you were likely walking around, talking to other employees. Maybe it was about your personal life, but it's also a pretty good chance it's about what one of you is working on, why that's valuable to the company. And I think that's where things get really interesting, because as you move down that spectrum, you can move towards, and we've kind of alluded to this, mission-driven companies where from the CEO down or from the founder down, they make it very clear why the product exists and how it seeks to impact the world. And then ensuring that you're bringing in people who are bought into that idea. And I think that gets harder as a company grows. But in early stages, it can be really valuable to bring in an interview and then hire people who identify with that mission, and not just like they say like, yeah, sounds cool, but someone who understands, like, for example, at Blend, it was all about equitable access to mortgages and therefore housing. And so people who connected with the idea of struggling to be able to afford a house, especially if it had to do with your financial situation or your marital status or something that caused judgment to be cast upon you and therefore put you at a disadvantage. This is something that a lot of people in the early days at Blend really cared about, was creating access, and I'm sure many still do. But the idea that once you understand what your company's product is responding to or meant to solve, having employees that actually understand their connection to that. And I think this actually draws a circle around some of the other topics we've covered, because what can be really interesting here is everything from feedback to the way people feel included at a company to their success onboarding all ties to their ability to understand, how do I fit into the bigger picture here? And I think when you're in sales, it's really obvious. I'm bringing in sales, which brings in new customers, which helps, increase the revenue and increase the knowledge. I think what gets harder is people get a little further removed from this. So maybe like a recruiter, they might have a little bit more sense, but they kind of feel disconnected from the mission, because they're more like, oh, I'm hiring people and bringing them in, and I try to do my best to hire the best people. But, and then this is speaking from my own ego and experience, but then you get into like L&D or HR operations where you're really, you're moving people around or you're trying to create programs, but you start to feel disconnected unless you build that into what you're building. And so I've had the pleasure of building several onboarding and orientation programs at these types of companies. And so building in something that connects people to the mission right when they get in the door is another really successful way to help people understand how they connect to what the company is trying to do, and hopefully therefore be more interested in, rather than needing this kind of, back to the original question of like, is it a carrot or a stick that will motivate people to want to be profitable, want to work hard, versus, just kind of get paid and send it in. And so these are all different ways I think about to try to engage people around this idea.
So is culture built from the founder perspective out, or is it something that comes from maybe the first couple employees that you hire? And that's probably a personality thing. There are probably some top-down cultures where the founder is very strong on it, and others that evolve. But maybe you can speak to that for a bit.
Yeah, I mean, if we had to attempt to, this is all kind of just, I don't know if there's a lot of hard science behind this, but if we had to attempt to enumerate, I would say that a third of the culture will always be defined by who the CEO or the leader of the company is. And so if you're blessed to have kept the original founder in that position for as long as possible, that person is the person who attracted everyone to the company and, brought them in, especially at the first couple hundred employees. And so that person plays a huge role in their behavior. So have had success and struggles where you're trying to roll out new practices or behaviors at a company. And if the CEO doesn't follow that practice, it's not going to be, very successful. You're going to have to work a lot harder. I think the other question there is how much space does the company create for employees to feed that culture? Because I do believe there is a strong capability for people to essentially establish what we consider like a grassroots culture, which is employees voicing themselves in one way or another to say, I want to be able to do this at work. And this could be anything from the type of projects to the type of communication to the perks and the layout of the building to how people are allowed to spend their free time, things like that. And so I've seen both successes and failures where employees have tried to gather into groups and then communicate a demand or a desire to, say, the people department or the executive team. And I think that plays a big role in culture because It also depends on the economic factors, but often employers are really desperate to keep their employees. And I think that's another thing that factors in here is if your goal is to keep people happy and employed at your company, then you have to listen to what they're going to say unless you've already developed like a really kick-ass system or way of running your company. And I know this because this has been my job my whole career is I report to a head of people who is concerned about are people feeling like they're growing and getting more out of their time here than just a paycheck. And my job is to either help those people realize it or to create programs that actually do add more to their experience.
I actually heard Bill Gates in an interview saying that if the top 35 people at Microsoft would leave, Microsoft would be worthless. So that's how much people are valued, even in such an established company. And the statement is a little bit older, so maybe in the last couple of years he sees it's different. But that's the value of like the people in those companies.
Yeah, and if that tells me anything, it just a struggle that I see again and again is executives who state a desire to see a company move in a certain direction, but expect that to happen at the senior leadership level right below them and down. And then they don't participate. And I think one of the more painful things I've ever seen is when you're trying to instigate something like that and maybe 2 out of 9 executives really wholeheartedly participate, whether it's in a program I've developed or in an event that a company is hosting to try to help people feel a certain way or gather more experiences. Executives, and I have empathy for them. I think they often come from a place of solitude. If you're an executive, you're kind of like a celebrity at your company. And so it's a little bit riskier what you say, how you show up, things like that. And so I think sometimes this can actually make people feel isolated. And they're like, and I've even heard executives say, well, I didn't want to go because I didn't want to be the person that would make everyone else feel like, they're all being watched over or something like that. And so, but getting those people to participate or drive the changes or the cultural movements that they wish to see happen is a critical aspect. And I think that's reflected in the quote about 35 executives at Microsoft.
Yeah. So how do you address if there is someone in your culture that falls in misalignment, maybe on an executive level, and maybe they're micromanaging their people? How do you address that to realign them with or if there's someone, and it could be a co-founder too, who thinks culture should be very different. And that could be based on their cultural understanding, because they might come from a different place. Just like I'm an immigrant here, I come from a completely different set of values. So how do you, or how have you handled that in the past?
Sure. And just to clarify, is the question just explicitly focused on executives and co-founders?
Yeah, I mean, we start there and then we can explore.
Sure. Sounds good. Yeah, so I've had the experience of all of this. I've seen a co-founder who had a aligned but also slightly different vision for how a company was going to be run, and in that case, I think you tend to find, and this is both through experience and through stories I've heard from other people at other companies, and you just see this like. Sometimes co-founders, 2 people will start a company together, 2 or 3 co-founders, but ultimately one person becomes the primary decision maker, whether they take on the title of CEO or they informally become the person that's, I don't know if it's naturally because they're more charismatic or because they're involved in the more critical decisions, but a critical mass of employees, either explicitly or implicitly decides who that leader is, and that's the person that they follow. What can be interesting here is that then as companies get more established and executive teams come into play, they can actually play a role in what happens next, either by encouraging that co-founder to participate or by encouraging the lead co-founder to think about how to relegate that person to a less prominent role. And I've seen that go down, and that's it's always tough, but it also is important to make those tough calls, because at a certain point, it's no longer just you and your friend running a hobby project, but it's really hundreds of people are relying on the success of the company for their job and for their future. And I think that's a point at which there needs to be clear leadership in place. So that's my answer for the co-founder scenario. I think for the broader question, which is much more common, is what if one or more executives are a bit out of touch with what the group is saying they want to do? I think it's important to acknowledge that in the scenario we're talking about, we're going to go ahead and assume that there is some form of critical mass, either the CEO or someone else is saying, we're taking the company in this direction. And you've got an executive who either is actively working against that or not bought into that. So I think, is that okay if we work off that scenario?
Yeah,
okay.
Sure. Good.
So from there's a couple different options, and I've seen a couple different types of this play out. So the most direct one is if the CEO is really bought into the direction, they're the manager of the executive team, and that's always the case. And I think it often gets overlooked. I know in every feedback program I've ever run, half the executives are like, we're going to skip that. The CEO is not going to give feedback. He does it in his own way. And it's like, okay, cool. Well, what if the rest of the employees hear that? Like, can they all do it in their own way, or do we believe in this system? So I think that often ends up being a part of this is the CEO going to make a commitment to what we say we're doing, and are they going to manage their own team, which is their executive board, and help them understand either why it's important to move in the direction together, or better understand what that person is holding against the direction they're moving in. Because often if someone's upset or making it difficult, it's because they don't feel heard in terms of what they see could go wrong, or what they see as other options. So that's the most direct route, is the CEO goes directly to their direct report, which is the other executive, and says, you need to get in line or help us understand why you can't. Beyond that, when it falls to someone like me, or a senior leader in the people department, or sometimes there's like a strategic team or a communications team that often end up being the kind of proxy for that conversation. And then it comes down purely to relationship, because you're not really leveraging power in the way that a CEO can leverage power against an executive. You're someone who may even report up to this person, or you're clearly below them, but in a different department. And from there, it's much more, this is back almost to our feedback conversation. It's a trust thing. Is there a relationship established where you can have a relatively candid conversation with this person, where you can say, here's what I'm trying to achieve. Here's the role that I would like to see you play in that. And I would love you to help me understand, what do you see that could go wrong here? Or how can I be successful here? And really making it a collaboration versus a request or a demand. Because anyone who's worked hard enough to get into an executive position does not like people coming to them with demands like that. And so where I've seen the most success is building my own relationships with these people. I think of there was a chief legal officer at Blend. She may still be there. And she was always a great ally to me, even though we had no connection directly. If she knew a program I was working on, she would ask what's going on and what was needed of me, and then would bring that to her team. And I think that's the ideal relationship there. She would also share like, hey, I don't think your plan's going to work, when I would show her something. And then that was a great learning experience for me to figure out how I could improve something that would make it more exciting to executives to see and believe in and get behind. So that's another part of this. Just like we started on how young people or frankly anyone in their career could solicit feedback at any point to better themselves and understand themselves. I think when you have a goal like a project launch or a product launch, it's great to get feedback early and often from the people who are going to be expected to endorse it, because executives do not love if you bring them something that they haven't heard of before and now they're being asked to reinforce it to their teams. And so that's another thing I would think strongly about.
So what I'm hearing is also from a founder's perspective, everybody has to act in alignment, including the founder. He has to kind of live the culture. Otherwise, it's broken in the first step. And then you just have to have an open level of inclusive conversation where you make people part of the relationship and kind of craft the culture, but also can do what you say, on all levels. From an executive level, people need to act in alignment with what they're trying to cater into the culture.
Yeah, you've actually sparked one other idea that I've played a role in and would be worth sharing with anyone curious.
Go ahead.
Which is essentially bringing together a couple things we've already talked about. So you've got a CEO or a founder. Find out how he or she thinks about the culture, what they believe in. And this doesn't even have to mean, because sometimes, frankly, they're young enough or inexperienced enough to not have really thought about it at an organizational level. It's actually very unnatural to one day be making decisions and taking risks and making plans. And you've got 10 people that back you, and that's really cool and personal. But next thing you know, you've got 400 people looking at you and wondering what to do. And so people in my position, or someone in communications or HR, and frankly, anyone's capable of this. But the idea here is learn how the executive or the CEO operates and find out what he or she is doing that other employees are starting to replicate, and then actually bother to take the time to, whether it's doing some copywriting or marketing or turning it into like formal principles, but taking their natural behavior and making some kind of like, I don't know, call it, often companies call these their principles. And then you mentioned Ray Dalio. So often companies will take the founders' beliefs and action styles and turn them into principles that help everyone else understand essentially how to scale working with that person. And the reason for that, like tactically, can be when a company is really small, you can just go to a founder and say, what do you want to do? How should we do this? But by taking those ideas and turning them into principles, you're actually able to create a space where I, as like a manager of L&D, might not be able to get the CEO's time. But if I can look at the principles, I can generally apply those to the decisions I'm struggling with and think, how might he or she answer what I would want to ask? And you can usually get pretty far. And this also helps employees understand, whether it's a hint and a nudge or it's something a little more strict, essentially how people are expected to behave at the company. And so trying to take the founders' behavior and scale the ones that you want to see continued. That's a really honest way to say, we're essentially going to do the work of taking what cultural behaviors people are going to adapt anyway and just formalizing them in some kind of document that can be viewed and reviewed and shared with people.
One of the things that came to mind now is I love the way Warren Buffett does it. And he has the newspaper test, he has his annual letters. And basically all it says to the CEOs of the companies that are managing in his portfolio is that whatever you're doing in any given business year, you should be able to print it on the first page of a newspaper. And we give that newspaper to everybody you care for, from your family to your friends. And if all your actions align and you print it there, then we're good.
Yeah, that's a good philosophy. I don't think I've heard that one before. I love that. Yeah.
I love that one because it's so crisp and you can't go a whole lot. Sure, he's like, we could write 50 pages of how they're supposed to behave, but I feel like if they pass this test, the majority of things are taken care of.
I suppose that begs the question, does he use that as a part of a feedback model? I wonder if he starts to see them behaving in a way that he doesn't condone, would he say, this isn't going to look good on your newspaper headline or something to call that to attention?
Well, the interesting thing is he actually says that most of the CEOs in his portfolio, he barely talks to them. He's like, they've been running the company exceptionally well before I bought it. Now they're sending the check to Omaha. They're still running the company. They could all retire. They're worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So why would I interfere? Like some of them, he says, I haven't talked to them in a year or so. They get my letters occasionally, and that's that.
What a dream.
Yeah, that's like, I guess, a dream culture from kind of the CEO perspective. It's where you get to the degree where people just live that level of culture. So, but I guess that's because he lives a set of values where people are attracted to sell their companies to him because they align with his values. Like the people that he considers buying out, they're already aligned because their books are a certain way. The way
he's gotten a good look and met them to an extent beforehand.
Yeah, and it's based on that entire overall arc of trust and values, which I think is the strongest argument to maintain a set of values. Is just go and live by it, and you will attract the people that are likewise. And I think that's where a culture building comes from, and that's also a bit how I approach it. I'm like, I just want to make sure that whoever is an extension of me in my business aligns with my values, and without me micromanaging, they act in the best interest of not only themselves but all of us, and they treat whoever they're facing in a same or similar fashion as I would.
Yeah, I think that's the way to go about it. And a lot of the problems that we run into afterwards are just scaling that effort and figuring out how to maintain it.
So on a personal note, that's one of my favorite questions is, what do you consider a life well lived?
Well, number one for me is some form of introspection or insight. Said another way, a life not well lived is a life lived just kind of constantly in movement and pursuit without bothering to stop and check in. Is this enjoyable? Why am I doing it? Do I know why I'm doing it and what I'm working towards? So that would be where I start. And I think what that makes me think of is essentially a life where you are able to determine what you are satisfied with or happy with in yourself, and also what you'd like to see change or where you'd like to experience new experiences, and then going out and making those things happen. And certainly in a world like we live here in America, where most of us work 5 days a week out of 7, I think a life well lived is one where you understand why you're doing that. Either you're actively gaining something from your career because you're doing something you love, or you're impacting a space that you care about, or, and this is perfectly acceptable, or you're making a bunch of money that is going to allow you to do something else that you want to do, whether it's start a business or support a family or go on adventures. But for me, my biggest struggle or my biggest concern when I meet someone is when they don't know why they're pursuing what they're pursuing. They're just doing it usually as a reflection of what they've been told to do by their parents, or what they've seen society kind of generally recommend to do. And so helping people kind of ground themselves and figure out, is this really what you want? And getting clear about that can be really rewarding, but also peaceful, and kind of give this sense of acceptance to people that, yeah, I used to chase this thing, but I didn't really want it. And now that I'm in touch with that, I can focus more on what I do want. And then from there, of course, it's things like having powerful and meaningful relationships, understanding how to give and take from the world in a way that helps us build a community. I really value people who understand that we have roads and businesses and government and all these things because a bunch of people got together and decided these were good ideas and that we ought to build them together. And yep. I really worry as we have a bigger and bigger population and everyone's on the internet and creating identities and brands, which are really powerful. But I think it's also a reaction to feeling like, am I unique? Do I have a place here? And so a lot of what I try to do is help people understand that they do have a place and they don't need to work that hard to find what that place can be.
So how would you help somebody get in touch with that place within themselves? Like, I mean, it's so easy to get lost in what is being catered to us. And it's actually, we've never been bombarded with more impressions before in the history of mankind.
Yeah. Yeah. So what you're asking about is actually the kind of joy of my life these days, since I mean, we didn't really get into my whole career, but essentially I spent 10 years working across Pandora and Blend and Gong, which are all companies we mentioned. And I ended that at the end of last year, and just early this year launched into my own coaching practice. And so this is something I do with, I would say 90% of my clients are looking for something in this space. So the key areas is, one, building a trusted relationship. And relationships are usually built over time, but with the right questions and the right statements and the right level of vulnerability, you can build trust really quickly. And so getting to a point, for me personally, what I like to do when someone's working on this stuff is asking them questions, really powerful questions that often people, they might not seem powerful if you see them written out on a piece of paper, but the reason they're powerful is because we just don't stop and take time to ask ourselves these questions. And often no one else in our life is asking them. And so as a coach, I get to put really big questions in front of people. Sometimes they're about their past. Sometimes they're about how they're acting today. Sometimes they're about where they want to go in the future. And then usually once you have an understanding of what someone has or hasn't enjoyed about where they come from and what they want to bring into their future, you can also ask really powerful questions about why is something that you're saying is important to you today, why is that important? And that's where I found some of the most incredible results, whether it's helping. There's a co-founder of a company that I'm working with who was trying to figure out what are his personal values and how will that affect actually what we've been talking about, how will that affect the culture of the company as it grows? And so asking, multiple layers of questions. Well, tell me about an experience, and then asking a follow-up question that gets deeper at why does that matter, or what does that say about the world? So asking these types of questions help people get more in touch with really what you asked before, which is like, what is a life well lived for them?
So what does a journey look like if someone gets in touch with you, and where can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm all over the internet right now. My handle on everything is my name. So it's the letter R as in Ryan and the letter T as in Thomas, and then my last name, which is Giordano. So RT Giordano. I'm the same thing on LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. So you can find me there. And then I also have my website, rtgiordano.com. And that's where you can learn about what I'm up to. And also if you're interested in engaging in coaching, where you can learn about that as well. The first conversation, for one, everyone always wonders, the first conversation is always free. And the reason for that is that myself and the individual I'm potentially going to work with are both assessing each other. And usually what they're looking for is this someone that I would enjoy working with? Is this someone I would trust to both be vulnerable with, but also to hold me accountable? which are two of the things I do most for people, is give them the space to be honest about something in their life that they may not even be telling their, closest friends and family, but also be able to hold them accountable and say, you said you want this. What are you doing to work towards it? And having them give me commitments and make commitments and not take action. And then on my side, what I'm usually evaluating for is where they're at. What do they want? And frankly, as someone so I haven't mentioned this, but both my parents are marriage and family therapists. So I come from the world of psychology, and I also work with a therapist myself, which I recommend when needed. But the big difference between a therapist and a coach is that a therapist is often looking at your past and helping you integrate or resolve things as you go about your future. A coach is not necessarily the best person first of all, we're not like psychologically qualified to go that deep into things. There are some risks for your mental health, but a coach is really supposed to be finding someone who is already in a pretty good space and looking to get more. They're looking to speed up or accelerate or deepen what they're already doing. And so usually what I'm assessing for in the first call is, where's the person today? What do they know about what they want? What do they know about what they don't know? And ultimately, what are they driving after? Because an interesting thing that happens on this journey is that the first call is usually about 30 to 45 minutes. It's kind of most of it's a meet and greet, where about 70% of the time is the coachee telling me, why they sought out coaching and about their background. And then I give some time to, sample what coaching feels like. What I find the most interesting is that the second call always reveals a second and more deeper desire. So, for example, the first call might be, well, I want a new job. I'm not happy at my job and I want a new job. And then, and that's a perfectly reasonable thing to reach out for a coach for, and we can work on that. But as I find, as I get to know people and ask the right questions, you come to find out it's not really the job. It's I want something that will make me happy, or I want fulfillment in my life. And so as you get to those deeper values and uncover those things, that gives you a lot more to work with. And so the journey usually from there is then beginning down, what are people working towards? Is it better understanding themselves? Should we do some exploration on their values and any of their negative self-talk? Or is it more about something really practical? Often people do have a plan of, I want to launch my own business, or I want to make a change from this job to this job. Can you hold me accountable, ask me good questions, and help me think through how to do that? So I enjoy doing all those things.
That's awesome. So for all of you that want to take life to the next level, you definitely have to check out Ryan, and schedule an intro call, get to know him and see if he's the right fit for you to take it on and, have a sustainable change in your life. And thanks again, Ryan, for taking the time. Oh,
yeah, a pleasure to be here. I mean, I'm a big fan of what you're up to. Would love to stay in touch and continue any opportunities to collaborate or speak again. I feel like there's a lot more we could get into, but
yeah, I feel like we could have talked for another hour.
I know. Yeah. We mentioned yoga at the top of the call, and I mentioned mindfulness, and there's a lot of connections there. So we'll have to get back into it at some point, but thank you so much for what you're doing and the message that you're spreading around. I hope people are enjoying it, and it was a pleasure to take part.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you for joining us at The Path to Wealth. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Check out our upcoming guests and be sure to share it with all your friends and family that want to take their life to the next level of wealth.